So I've mentioned more than once in the past that I was looking at the idea of doing a deep dive. And this is, well, my first deep dive. It's very similar to the how to save series, but not at the same but with a little bit of a twist. Because instead of saying how I'm going to save something, we're doing a deep dive into the career of one of the most creative minds in professional wrestling, Jim Cornette. Well, let's get into it. Cornette's first booking job was on the WCW creative team starting in 1989 following Great American Bash, when he explained to Gary Juster, I believe it was Gary Juster, why WCW should not be running the Omni on a Wednesday and should have been running the Omni over the weekend, because the Omni was one of the biggest cities and biggest towns for the territory over the past, since Corny got there in 1985. And it always had been one of the biggest drawing areas. But those who signed the towns weren't aware of that. And were saving Chicago and California and Texas and places like that for the weekend, and putting the smaller towns, the towns in Crockett's old home base, during the week, because they didn't realize how much drawing power the Omni had. Cornette left the creative team following continued disagreements with other members of the team, including Jim Herd and Jim Barnett. It has been well documented, Corny's disagreements with Jim Herd over the years, and not as well documented his disagreements with Jim Barnett, because Jim Barnett wasn't the same creative mind that he was back when he was running Australia and put Australia on the map as far as wrestling is concerned, and then came back and saved Georgia and the NWA in Georgia during the wrestling war in the early 1970s, because Jim Barnett had aged. Jim Barnett was just there to be a quintessential yes man for the office, and that basically made it very hard to want to work with Jim Barnett at the time. Cornette would eventually branch away and start Smoky Mountain Wrestling, his own wrestling promotion, in October 1991, about a year after leaving WCW in 1990. Smoky Mountain was Cornette's first attempt at booking his own promotion, and he found real quick that the struggle that Dusty and Ole faced booking in Crockett and in Georgia was not a joke. Cornette would carry on the old school style of booking with a mixture of veterans and young talent, namely Bob Armstrong as his veteran, and SMW would give Al Snow, D'Lo Brown, the Gangstas, Chris Jericho, Lance Storm, Glenn Jacobs their big break in America. Before working for Cornette, Jericho and Lance Storm had not even gotten into the U.S. yet. Neither had Kane. Kane had not caught on in America before his time with Cornette. Yes, Glenn Jacobs spent some time in Memphis before heading to Puerto Rico, but before Cornette brought him back, he was in Puerto Rico. And he only brought him back on Dutch's recommendation, because Dutch Mantell recommended Kane come back to the States because Dutch was booking in Puerto Rico and didn't have anything left for him to do in Puerto Rico. But also, Cornette gave Bob Armstrong another opportunity. He gave Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson a fresh start as the Rock and Roll Express. He gave the Heavenly Bodies Jimmy Del Rey and Tom Pritchard their break to get into WWF. He gave D'Lo Brown his opportunity to get into WWF. He gave Al Snow, Dirty White Boy, Tony Anthony. You know, the list goes on and on and on, the amount of people that Cornette helped get into the WWF and get their big break through Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Near the end of Smoky Mountain, Cornette was brought into the WWF as the WWF set up a working agreement with Cornette, because it was at the start of, or near the beginning of, the Monday Night Wars, and they were all, you know, it was also at the time that WWE was competing with WCW, not as heavily as they were at the end of the 1990s, but in the middle of the 1990s, the heat started building, and WWE needed a working agreement. WWE needed a place to find talent, and Cornette hated WCW. Cornette tried to work with WCW, but it didn't work. So Cornette moved on to WWE and tried to work with Vince. And ultimately it worked out. Cornette was brought in. He started as the manager of Yokozuna. He brought in the Heavenly Bodies, giving them their big break, and Tom Pritchard would end up working with Chris Candido, who also got his start in WWE because of Jim Cornette. You know, like Paul Orndorff, who got his start in WCW because of Jim Cornette and Smoky Mountain Wrestling. But ultimately, Corny would start also managing Owen Hart and Davey Boy, and then following the closure of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Cornette would start on the creative team in WWE. Cornette would, at one point, it was just Cornette. You know, Cornette, Cornette and Bruce Pritchard would write the shows. As WWE was trying to evolve back to how Pat and JJ used to write the shows, Pat Patterson and JJ Dillon, and, you know, Corny and Corny and Bruce were trusted, but things weren't getting better, things were only getting worse. And it wasn't necessarily because of WWE, it was because of the business as a whole, still recovering from the media frenzy that took place at the beginning of the 1990s. Either way, though, you know, Cornette's time in WWE is well documented due to his developing hatred at the time for one Vince Russo, and ultimately it would become too much, and around 1999, Cornette would move from WWE to OVW in an attempt to escape the torture of Connecticut. He found a way to help the company. Cornette would work with Danny Davis to help create WWE's first developmental territory, and again, Cornette brought old school back to modern wrestling and helped establish WWE, the future of WWE. By that I mean, Cornette did not want things to go back to how they were or anything like that. It's that he wanted to use the talent of today and book with the concept and ideas that worked back in the day. At one point, Cornette was part owner of OVW, and he would sell his stock or stake back to Danny Davis, and again, to escape WWE, this time for good. Cornette would move to Ring of Honor to help kickstart another young promotion. At the time, though, Cornette was just the on-air talent, like the matchmaker or general manager, and he was not booking yet. Gabe Sapolsky was still the booker. Before he left OVW, Cornette put OVW in a very good position, but one horse-talking director of talent relations would change things, and that again is another thing that has been well documented, and that is Cornette's hatred of Johnny Ace. You know, Jim Cornette helped establish John Cena, Randy Orton, Batista, Brock Lesnar, Shelton Benjamin. Cornette was the guy behind the OVW's golden era of people coming up, and you don't know if they would have came up with the same gusto if not for the booking of Corny and Danny Davis down on OVW. Well, again, Cornette would be... This takes us to about 2005 or 2006 when Cornette would become a member of TNA. And TNA would he would join TNA's creative team, which included, at the time, Dutch Mantel, Terry Taylor, Vince Russo, Jeff Jarrett, and other things. And like I mentioned earlier, I will not break down his history with Russo because so much over the years has been well documented over the years about his history with Vince Russo that I'm not going to waste your time and document it again. But Cornette would spend about a year with TNA, leaving it around 2007, 2008, give or take, to go back to Ring of Honor. But this time, he'd go back to Ring of Honor as a booker. Cornette would take the book, and this is where the story comes in, where he would ultimately tell Kerry Silken at one point, if you don't book these guys, will people burn the seats? Meaning, cut down the amount of people you book to save a little bit of money. Like, you don't have to book the entire roster every single night. Because ultimately, when you're in the wrestling business, your goal is to make a profit. And if you're not making a profit, you gotta figure out why. And one of the reasons why could be overbooking. Cornette was the man in charge when Ring of Honor found their way to St. Clair. Originally, Ring of Honor was on the HDNet, and then ended up getting purchased by Sinclair Broadcasting. And that was the beginning of the end, because Cornette made the suggestion that, Sinclair not up the pricing or, do anything to ostracize the current fan base, and that is exactly what the New Honors did. Near the end of his tenure in Ring of Honor, he would start working with Delirious, aka Hunter Johnson, on the creative team, and Hunter would become a solid booker and have a solid booking tenure for Ring of Honor. Cornette would leave around 2012, and that was his last full-time position in the wrestling business, officially hanging it up and only making sporadic appearances for the time being. But this was the last time he was a member of a creative team in the wrestling business, because he realized the way he wanted to book was not going to be allowed anymore. I know this is pretty much how I should have started, but at the same time, this is better how we end. Cornette sat under many learning trees during his early years in the wrestling business, learning from legends like Ernie Ladd, Jerry Jarrett, Bill Watts, Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, Dusty Rhodes, and others. Starting in Memphis, Corny had the opportunity to learn from Jackie Fargo. Corny had the opportunity to learn from Jerry Jarrett, Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, Eddie Marlin, legends of the time. When he moved to Mid-South in 84, or late 83, he then had the opportunity to learn from Ernie Ladd. He learned more from Bill Dundee. He learned from Bill Watts. He learned from greats, extremely creative minds, because Ernie Ladd is one of the reasons why Bill Watts got successful, because of his booking. Bill Dundee also helped Bill Watts sustain the Mid-South territory, because Bill Dundee is more known for booking in the Mid-South territory than he is known for booking in Memphis. But Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler were able to sustain USWA or Continental and become known as the last territory to survive. But all those guys, for the most part, well, and also Jimmy would learn from Dusty in Crockett Promotions, but all those guys in one way or another were influenced by Eddie Graham and Dory Funk Jr., or Dory Funk Sr., because Eddie Graham was influenced by Dory Funk Sr. from his stay in Amarillo. But I wouldn't be surprised, well, and Bill Watts was influenced by Eddie Graham, Dusty Rhodes was influenced by Eddie Graham, and I wouldn't be surprised if other people were influenced by Eddie Graham too, so indirectly, Corny was influenced by Eddie Graham and Dory Funk Sr. Before I continue with this, the one thing that I think that is understated is how the notes that Cornette keeps, because Cornette still has all his books. Cornette kept the houses. Cornette kept the attendance. Cornette kept everything, like consistent notes to everything. So we could go back and look and say, okay, we made this house. This was the house 3 weeks ago, the last time we were at this town, and that makes his current podcast with Brian Lass all the more accurate, because it gives the opportunity for historical facts to carry more weight, because he has the notes to back it up. Speaking of historical facts, I don't know if a lot of people have heard this story before, but Cornette and WCW came with an idea to make a star out of Brian Pillman, after Booker Ric Flair requested Pillman work with Midnight to get himself ready for a feud with Flair. This was, I want to say between 89 and 90, because I think by 91 Cornette was gone, so I also think that, yeah, because I think by late 90 Flair had stepped down, or maybe early 1990 Flair had stepped down, because soon after Flair stepped down from booking, Cornette stepped down. So this was probably 1989. Either way. Cornette came up with the idea to get Brian Pillman over for a feud with Flair, and to establish Pillman as a sympathetic babyface in order to add an aura of realism to a lacking program. Cornette's idea was blocked by political maneuvering from Barnett and Jim Herd, and in turn, Pillman never got his push. Basically, the idea was that Cornette and the Midnight would injure Pillman's throat. They would do similar. They would run a similar angle that they did early on with the Rock and Roll, where they put the racket across his throat. I think a stun gun or something to that effect on the racket, and Pillman would land throat first on the racket, and they would play up Pillman's past throat injuries and throat surgeries, and question if Pillman would ever speak again, or be able to speak normal again, and it would just establish Pillman as a sympathetic babyface, because people would feel bad and hate the Midnight, because Midnight would be able to turn heel or be heels again, and it would allow for Pillman to be a sympathetic babyface, because people will feel, the dude won't be able to talk. And then ultimately it would come down to Pillman beating both the Midnight and getting his revenge on getting his revenge on Cornette to establish himself as a top guy. I'm not saying that this would have led to Pillman becoming a top star. I'm just saying it would have done its job to get him ready for Flair. If you want to hear more of an accurate story, then look up the story and have Corny tell it, because I think Corny would be able to tell it better than me. But in my opinion, this is one of the reasons why Cornette is unwilling to reason with people now, because he let it be early in his career, and ended up being right, so now he fights for his opinions instead of caving in. Cornette has earned his reputation, and I'm not saying he's always right. I'm saying that he was wrong this time, but was blocked from being proven right or wrong by someone who thought they knew better but didn't. So what I'm saying is that I'm not defending Cornette's attitude, but I'm saying that there's a reason why Cornette has his reputation, and I'm saying that there's a reason why I think that Cornette is unwilling to reason with people nowadays, because he tried to be that guy back in the day and it didn't work. And now he's unreasonable because he knows that when he caves in, he's usually proven right. But his idea didn't have the opportunity to be proven right or proven wrong. Cornette's legacy. Just take a second, look it in. Cornette was raised in the business to take it seriously, treat it with respect. And he attacks anybody that doesn't see it that way nowadays. And he doesn't understand why people can't treat it with respect. I agree that wrestling is better when you're not insulting the fans, but, that's just me. There is no, bullet point number 2 is what I just said, that a man of controversy now, as he takes exception to wrestlers of today not treating wrestling with respect. There is no reason why wrestling should not be treated with respect, because having realism as a cornerstone of your product or programming allows for suspension of disbelief to be easier, in my opinion. Overall, Cornette may not be top 5 best booker, one of the top five best bookers, and I think Cornette himself will probably say that he is not one of the top 5 best bookers. I think he would probably put Jerry Jarrett, Bill Watts, Eddie Graham, Dory Sr., and honestly Vince McMahon as the top 5. Maybe there will be some other person in there that I'm forgetting, but I think that's what Cornette would probably say. I do think Cornette would probably be in the top 10, but I don't think he's in the top 5, and I think he would probably even agree with that. The main reason why Smoky Mountain Wrestling closed is because in the wrestling hit a dark period in the mid-1990s, which is what I talked about earlier, where people were just not going to wrestling shows. Simple as that. People were just not attending wrestling shows because of the problems with the steroid trial, because of just lack of interest, because WWE was the same old product that it was. WCW killed a lot of the southern towns because of bad booking, because of bad management, because of just bad. Everything was bad during this time. In my opinion, philosophical differences ended his runs on creative teams, not his attitude. Okay, maybe his attitude didn't help in WWE, but that's just because he didn't like living in Connecticut and wanted to move back to Louisville. A difference of perspective should be able to be addressed among men and not written off as I have more power, so you listen to me. Think about that. A difference of perspective should be able to be addressed among men and not written off as I have more power than you, so you listen to me. Meaning, you should be able to talk out disagreements, not just use power to, not just use the power you have over somebody to try and manipulate them into seeing your perspective and saying that because you have more power, that means you're right and they're wrong. That's what happened to Cornette in WCW, and Cornette was never able to actually push power on somebody else, and it was just, that's where his attitude comes in of people saying he has a bad attitude because he's trying to put over the fact why he's right, and people are saying that he's wrong, and never giving him the opportunity to show why he could be right. Ultimately, what it comes down to is Cornette will always have a reputation now as a controversial figure, but at the same time, in my opinion, Cornette's legacy in the wrestling business is that of somebody who cared about the wrestling business, who treated the wrestling business with respect, and looked at the wrestling business as the reason why he is where he's at. And as somebody who, I think he looked at the wrestling business with gratitude, but at the same time, with a little bit of sadness because he knows the wrestling that he watched growing up, the wrestling that he was a part of from a very young age until 2012 doesn't exist anymore. And it's not going back to how, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. And I think that's maybe where a little bit of bitterness comes in and why Cornette might be as controversial as he is nowadays. But either way, this has been my first deep dive, and I hope you enjoyed. The door is open now for more deep dives in the future, as we explore some of the best minds to ever pick up a pen in the wrestling business. I figured there was no better person to start with than Mr. Controversy himself, Jim Cornette. If you liked the video, feel free to leave a like. If you want to comment on something your favorite Jim Cornette memory, feel free to drop a comment down below. And until next time, this has been Wrestling Express, and I will see you in the future. I'm not very good at outros, but either way, we'll see you next time.